Hello and welcome back to Building Brand Gravity. I'm Ann Green. I'm CEO here at GNS Business Communications, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Peter Gudritz of Dow. Hey, Peter.
Hey, Ann, how are you doing?
Very good, very good. Full disclosure, Dow has been a longtime client of ours, but I've been really interested in the arc of Peter's career for some time since he's been on my radar and I've gotten to know him a little bit. He is currently Global Director of Business and Marketing Communications within the Dow Global Public Affairs Group. But what's interesting, Peter, about the arc of your career, and I think something that we'll talk about today, is where you started and the evolution to where you are today. And one of my themes today is sort of the breaking down of boundaries between different areas within our field. But maybe we can start off with the arc of your career. From what I understand, you started in public policy and nonprofit. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right, and I appreciate being here. So thanks again for inviting me. Yeah, if you go actually even a little further back from there, right out of college, I actually started in sales. So I was in technology sales, and it was inside sales. I was on the phone all day long, and largely I did that because at the time I really after college just wanted to move to Chicago. Like that was my plan. So I got a job in sales, started working there. I mentioned that because I really think that training is hugely important for really any field that you go into, for a number of reasons. One, I think we're all in sales in some version, some capacity. So I think it's important for that respect. But as anybody that's done a job like that, it also kind of helps you build some grit because you basically spend all day long hearing no, and you have to think through kind of how to counter that. And as it relates to communications, you really have to think about kind of how you approach your customer, what messaging you want to use, how you're helping them solve their problems and things like that. So it was a really good 2 years, and I learned a ton. But it became pretty clear to me that that wasn't my long-term path. And so how I ended up in the nonprofit space and the policy space was I had been debating whether I was going to go to law school or get my master's in public policy. Landed on the public policy track. Found myself going from Chicago to DC, where I started studying master's in public policy with a focus on environmental policy. And so found myself working at an NGO called American Rivers, doing some river conservation policy work, mostly on public lands kind of stuff. And then after that, I moved over to a group called the Wildlife Conservation Society, which is a large international conservation organization. They run the New York zoos and aquariums, headquartered at the Bronx Zoo. And both of those cases were really good experience working on getting my hands deep in policy, but seeing the connection between kind of policy and how we reach out to our various stakeholders. It's not just government, right? So at American Rivers, I was helping with our advocacy, but I was also building a network of what we were calling river stewards across the country. So I had to reach out to a bunch of local river conservation activists. So that was a really interesting experience. And then at Wildlife Conservation Society, I was really getting deep into policy at that space because that's when climate policy was being heavily negotiated. This was 08, 09 timeframe. And so I got to work pretty heavily on that. And then I found myself coming over to Dow in a policy context. So a bit different than what I'd been working on the conservation side, but came into Dow and was working largely on energy policy, but a very different context because we're an energy intensive manufacturer, and so I really had to learn the ins and outs of energy policy in a totally different way. So it was a great way to get a really well-rounded experience.
I have to go back to the sales thing for a second because there's so much talk today about resilience, building resilience, and also being flexible in your mindset. And I think that early training, like you said, a couple of years will really get you very deep, especially as you said, you're on the front line of it every day. Did you feel it made you a bit more resilient and also sort of flexible in negotiating how you're going to deal with any given situation?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, for me, it was something that really stretched me out of my comfort zone. I am naturally more of an introvert. And so sitting on the phone all day long calling people I don't know is really not super comfortable for me. But it built up this kind of ability to hear rejections or at least counters to what I'm saying and think through that process of how I'm going to meet the needs of that customer. Maybe it doesn't work out, but you just have to think through things a little bit differently, and you're doing that day in and day out. So over time, you just get really kind of comfortable being in that space of either hearing no, being rejected, failing and having to come back, not meeting customer needs and having to call them and talk to them about what went wrong and take ownership for things. And so, you do that long enough, and it becomes something that, at least for me, it was just a little more comfortable. And I think that has helped, that has definitely served me throughout my career up to this point.
Well, two things come to mind right away. First of all, and we'll get to this soon in terms of the team that you work with today at Dow. It really puts you in a place of symbiotic, like compassion with media relations professionals who are calling in a different way. We don't like to think of it as sales, but it's got similar. The other thing is, and we'll definitely talk about this later, because when you and I were chatting and you were making points about what it means to be at a truly matrixed organization, I would assume that that background, it really gives you some compassion and connection with your colleagues in sales and other types of parts of the business.
Yep, absolutely. I mean, at the end of the day, they're the ones on the front lines with our customers. And so we'll get into it more, but arming them with the latest and greatest, and ensuring they have, all the right messages on some of our biggest initiatives, hugely important. I mean, they're the ones speaking to our customers, and it's ultimately our customers, right, that are driving our growth, driving our business. So hugely important.
Yeah, it's true. And it's interesting because as you're making that pivot from public policy to business and marketing communications, that sense of who is the stakeholder and who's the customer is really, really important. But even before we get there, one of the things you said that's very interesting about the work you did at the Wildlife Conservation Society and then the work you do today at Dow. And by the way, I now have the Simon and Garfunkel "It's All Happening at the Zoo" in my head. So that song, now that you said the Bronx Zoo, that's growing up in the 70s, that
Yeah.
commercial here was on all the time. So that's in my head now. Just a little side thing. But you talked about being in an energy intensive manufacturing business, and that's very interesting. You really have that through line of sustainability. And I think sometimes when people are thinking about energy, they're thinking about energy producers. They're not always thinking about energy users. And that must have been a really helpful lens for you to adopt or learn more about as you came into the Dow context from the nonprofit context. Is that true?
Yeah, absolutely. Like I said, I mean, I think it gave me a much more well-rounded perspective on how complex energy really is when we're talking about. But energy is what drives everything, right? I mean, even if you bring it forward to today and think about AI and all the data centers that are being built up, like one of the biggest issues that they're going to be contending with over time is access to electricity or energy to power those data centers. So it's a hugely important topic. And you come into a company like Dow, and half the company here experts on energy in some way, or energy or engineers, and so it was a huge learning curve for me at first. It's been great experience because it ultimately is what drives everything. So as we're looking to decarbonize over time, I mean, understanding the interplay between getting to a low carbon future and what that means for where we are today in terms of energy is crucial.
Yeah, it's so funny. As I kind of live in a double consciousness of a communications practitioner and counselor, but also an organizational leader in my role, and I'm always thinking about what are those messages and mindsets that are most important for this moment. And you're reminding me, it's like, first of all, pay attention to the nuance. And also, there's a lot of dynamic tensions out there. I was totally thinking also about AI, how we're in this moment where AI is going to advance so many things. People have a lot of feelings, hashtag feelings about AI. But the fact is that there's such amazing things happening, but it's also this really problematic challenge regarding the energy consumption. And that just seems to be the name of the game today. How is it that as professionals in this space, we really pay attention to deep nuance, which I think is very important working with companies like Dow, but also understand that some things are in dynamic tension with each other. Do you see that as a mindset or a skill set that should be cultivated these days?
Nuance is just really important for any of these big conversations. I think we can all agree that we need to decarbonize. We're very focused on it. It's one of our main strategic pillars is decarbonize and grow. But just saying we need to then switch to all renewables, that's not going to be practical. It's not going to work. We will see a lot of negative ramifications from that. And so you start talking about these spaces from a communication standpoint, from a policy standpoint, from a business standpoint, hugely complex. And so I think that we need to get to a place where we're less afraid of nuance. We need to get into it. And it doesn't mean that anyone is trying to slow anything down or anything like that. It's we're trying to get to a solution, and you have to understand the details and how things practically work in order to figure out how we move forward. So I think really working through those sticking points and the nuance, and I know we'll talk about it later, but I think this is where working across so many different stakeholder groups is really important because all those perspectives are crucial for anything that we're going to do from a business standpoint, right? We really have to understand how we're going to move the needle, and you really only can do that when you understand all of your main stakeholders' perspectives.
Yeah, there's very few silos anymore. Everything is permeable. Um, it's funny too, as you're talking about the nuance. I think in our society, we can see that zero sum thinking and binary thinking is not helpful, not helping us. And it's funny because starting my career in earned media and media relations in a PR setting at a place like Burson Marsteller, 30 years ago, that was very large and doing all the things, very broad and diverse in terms of our toolkit. But one of the things you confront early on in media relations is that the media itself can be a bit binary about things. It's hard to express those nuances and shades of gray, but I say that with utmost respect for our democratic free press, which is big and roiling and crazy and all kinds of things at once. But I think it's interesting, that multi-stakeholder environment and the nuance that we have to hold. One thing, this actually transitions to a very interesting part. So between the public policy and then the role that you're playing today, which I want to get into more, you were in the office of the CEO for a while at Dow. And that to me is a really interesting bridge, because talk about getting the bird's eye view of the whole stakeholder landscape. How did that experience sort of shape you or inform you or widen your lens, or whatever metaphor you want to share with me?
Yeah, I mean, it was great experience, and I think from a going back to the career arc discussion, not something that was on my radar, but that's probably true of almost every single role that I've taken.
I love that though. I think that's amazing.
Right? I've been open to things. I've had goals. I've had interests, all that, but I've rarely kind of pointed to a job and said I want that job. I've kind of just said yes to things as they've come along. So going back to 2015, this was our previous CEO, his chief of staff at the time, reached out to me, and we had some conversations, and I decided to join the team, and it made a lot of sense at the time because um, I was in a policy and an advocacy role at the time, and our CEO was very active in those spaces. So I had a familiarity of the spaces that he was operating in. So moved into that space. But to your point, you then very quickly see it across the entire organization, and it's an interesting space to lead. So for us, it lines up under our communications function. So there's the executive communications piece of it, and then there's kind of just the general executive support that comes along with it, the preparation, the thinking through how best to use this individual's time across a large global company. And so for me at that point, 5 years into my time at Dow, it was an amazing way to see across the company, to go to all sorts of our production facilities and all sorts of different regions. And so the learning curve there was it was great. It was rapid. You got to get up to speed pretty quickly, but it was just such a tremendous way to see the company, and to your point, the breadth of the stakeholders that at that level you're having to engage with, right? So, all of our top customers are going to want to have time at some point with the CEO. All of our policymakers, the CEO is helping to open doors, and they want to meet with him. Obviously, our employees, right? They're a huge part of things, and so just thinking through that broad landscape, and then I was kind of in a unique position of one when I first started, is when we also announced a major transaction of the Dow DuPont merger, and so that kind of shook up the landscape. Like literally the day that my stuff left, I had been living in Philadelphia, was moving back to Midland, Michigan, where we're headquartered, and literally the day that my stuff left Philadelphia is the day that we announced the merger.
Just a
So
small thing,
just a
just a
small thing.
tiny thing.
So yeah, so the landscape shifted a little bit. So we worked through that, but then was also fortunate enough in that period to work through a CEO transition. So previous CEO retired, new CEO, who is our current CEO, Jim Fitterling, came in, and you get to see a lot from that perspective of different styles, how they apply those to their leadership of an organization. And because we were going through this merger and then ultimately spinning out as the new Dow, as we were calling it, how you're bringing new culture into the organization and how we're framing things differently. And it was a really good opportunity to kind of think through from my standpoint, kind of how we strategically uh, used his time, and how we thought through what the biggest things were to tackle initially, but to really see from that level the consistency in message and the real passion for the team and for people, and like that's how we're going to move forward. And I think that was just, it was a great learning opportunity for me. Real privilege to be able to you know be close to leadership at that level. It opens a lot of doors to be around leadership at a lot of other companies, so you get to see a lot of different styles. um, and ultimately, I think you get to work on a lot of different things. But I always say what's also unique about it, at least the way we were structured as a small team, a lot of responsibility you don't really own much, right? So you're kind of pulling on different parts of the organization to get your work done. And, for me, then working through the matrix organization that we are, once again, it's a skill set that, you know, probably had a little bit of it coming in, but you're not going to be successful in that role unless you can navigate that. So put that on steroids a little bit for me.
Oh, I bet. And it's interesting. First of all, there's you're making me reflect on the fact there's moments in our career that sometimes we see them when we look back. Sometimes we know it's happening at that moment that are really a masterclass in a way. Or you can think of another analogy where there's just this confluence of opportunities or this moment in time where it's just going to be this big leap of growth and might be hard, might be different, but it's exciting. And I believe, were you still in the office of the CEO during the COVID when
I
that was
was.
unfolding?
I
Yeah.
was, yeah.
That's another big moment in time too.
Absolutely. And, so you learn a lot about how to, one, the critical importance of a steady hand, calm demeanor, right? Because all of a sudden, a lot of people are looking at you when things change overnight. We're sending people home, right? Yet we also have, a huge percentage of our workforce that's going to work every day in this environment because we're running 24/7. So yeah, really interesting vantage point to see things and also to learn how to adapt very quickly, right? So we at the time, I was helping out with our global leadership conference that we put on every year. We obviously stopped that, and so adapting quickly to say we still need to align with the organization, but now we have to do this in this virtual environment that at the time was not what it is today, as everybody knows. And then, I think we'll probably touch on this later, but just the amount of internal communications at that point it just went through the roof and gave me a deep appreciation for the value of it that I see so clearly now in my current role. It's a different application of it, but it's just so it's so important. So it gave me a really deep appreciation for that as well.
Yeah, another binary from back in the day that I've observed was this sense of internal communications versus external communications. So, obviously, things like social media, two-way conversation, the evolution of the web broke a lot of that down. Okay, and society changes generationally. But also, I think it was a false binary to begin with in many ways, although it was easier to command and control things in and out back in the day. Not totally, but I think the other thing is there was a real hierarchy, from my observation, about external comms being the thing and internal comms being, oh, yeah, we have to do some internal comms. I think that has radically shifted. I used to talk about, to me, the drop falls in the pond and the first ring that radiates out is your own people and your own internal stakeholders. How has your understanding of what has been known as internal communications changed? I mean, do you agree with some of what I'm thinking that there was never, it shouldn't have been a binary to begin with in some ways?
I do, and you used the social as a great example. If you look at our social channels, some of the highest engagement on our social channels are our employees, right? So that's where a lot of our employees are learning about things that we're doing and seeing. Right? It's yeah, we're doing stuff through internal channels as well, but a big percentage of our population doesn't have access to a computer, right? Because they're in plants and in the manufacturing environment. But they're personally on LinkedIn or X or something like that. And so those channels are actually really important for our internal audience as well. But I just, if you go to, so in the COVID context, very very rapidly we had to, we were meeting with leaders. Our leadership, what we define like people leaders, so it's about the top 3,500 within the company.
Which is a lot of people leaders to reach.
It is. And so we were doing weekly calls with them to align on kind of here's what we're doing, here are the next steps. We would highlight some, we were doing things like, turning over some facilities to produce hand sanitizer. Like we were doing a lot of that stuff. So we were aligning around some of those activities we were doing, but also aligning on kind of the nuts and bolts of how we're operating through this environment. And then weekly, there was an all employee communication that went out as well. So that's a lot of communication. As we look forward to today, I think that we probably came down a bit on the overall. I mean, we're not doing that much internal, but if you think about within our businesses, it's really really important that this concept of kind of internal for external. Right? We have to talk to our employees to align them around strategy and what are our major initiatives and what are we really, really focused on? What does the market look like today? Are we in a challenging environment? Are we in a growth environment? What do things look like and how is that informing what we do? Because then our employees become our ambassadors, right? Not just our sales folks, but yes, our sales folks who are going out and meeting with our customers every day. So they definitely have to have that. Any employee, they're talking to their friends, their families. We are generally, yes, we have some sites in bigger cities, but generally speaking, we're located in smaller towns, smaller communities around the world. We're tightly knit within those communities. And so our employees need to be armed with the ability to go and speak about what we're doing or be informed about what we're doing, right? So they become our biggest ambassadors. And so that's really, really important. And then you just get into like the nuts and bolts of building company pride, super important, and making sure that people really understand the things behind our when we talk about decarbonize and grow or transform the waste when we're talking about plastics. What does that really mean? What is the work that we're really doing? And so the internal part, I genuinely believe you just kind of can't be successful in anything that you're doing if you're not able to align and encourage and inspire your employees around all the great work that you're doing. So
I couldn't agree more. And frankly, it's a wonderful laboratory to test how messages land. And I say that in not in a very authentic way, what resonates, because we all know as people who are really what we're trying to do in this business. And the reason I definitely accidentally fell into this field and, I was going to be a literature professor. I'm very interested in the written language and that's like a frustrated academic at heart. So I love training and teaching. But I think what's been fascinating about this business is not just learning, so much learning. Like you said, I used to go to factories in the early days with early clients or manufacturing facilities. And I was like, I had no idea that this was all happening. So learn, learn, learn. But the other thing is to really understand we're here to cultivate understanding between people. We're here to try to improve literal communications between people. And that could be a marketing message too. I want to give something of service to you and I want to serve it at the right time because you need this thing or this service or you want to learn more. But it's amazing internally if you can't kind of, people talk about hearts and minds, if you can't bring that excitement or that understanding to your own team, especially when it's as global and large as Dow. What an incredible incubator for understanding, how messages are received and how they resonate. If you don't start there, where are you going to start?
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Couldn't agree more.
So you were from public policy, office of the CEO. Now you're global director of business and marketing communications. So years ago, what did you think business and marketing communications meant? Like what was your perception of what that would be? And did you self-identify with that at all before evolving, I think, and bringing a ton of skill sets to the role now?
Yeah, so interestingly, when I was back in the public policy role, at some point I was actually having conversations about moving into a role that was within business communications, and part of that was just again it was exploring some interests and seeing what different opportunities were out there, and then as tends to happen, another role opened up, and I got offered the role, and so I went on to do more of an advocacy thing, but I think. I've been close to it. I've been within our public affairs leadership team for a number of years now, so I had a decent understanding of everything that went into it. But if I'm being totally honest, I think I tended towards really kind of understanding the what we would call more purely marketing communications work. I understood the promotional activities and all the responsibilities around that and what we were doing to try to get in front of our customers and trade shows as an important piece of that and how we're using digital channels and things of that nature. What I think I can say now being a year and a half or so into the role, I probably did discount or just didn't have a great awareness of all the what I would call business communication stuff that goes into the role. So, there we're talking about real strategic communications around big business initiatives, the executive communications support, right, from our business presidents or our, global marketing leaders. There's a lot of communication support that goes around, when they're going out and talking about the business and talking about Dow. So that's a huge part. When we're doing, various versions of M&A, the team gets involved in that. And then, there's crises from times, there's issues that need to be managed. And again, it's this team that really is on the front lines within the business helping to manage that. Yes, with others in corporate and government affairs and the whole, again, matrix and diversity of folks around the company. But I think that's a piece of it that I really wasn't surprised to learn, but probably didn't have the full context on just how much of that is part of the role and important for everyone within the team, right? Not just the kind of top leaders within the team, but really everybody. Everybody gets involved in some respect. So
It's exciting to peel back the layers of the onion. Again, you were directly involved with a lot of that, but then to peel deeper and see, and the interplay between what might be understood as business or corporate communications and the marketing communications side that might be more customer or prospect driven. Seeing that symbiotic relationship between the two and how the issues landscape and articulating really purpose and values and also very tangible. You've talked about two of them, the declimatizing and also reducing waste, the plastics piece that you folks are working really hard on. How that creates a conversation that ultimately does have a lot of customer impact. I mean, how have you seen, Peter, as you reflect on your role and moving toward it, how have you seen business comms or marketing comms changing over time? Well, what's your reflections on the landscape that you and your team are working in now?
yeah, I think no question the importance of the multi-stakeholder environment is just huge. So if you kind of take a step back and look at DAO overall, right? Um, so we have, I'll talk a little bit about, since the time that Jim came in, new DAO and looking forward. So we no longer have a mission. We have an ambition, right? And the ambition is to be the most innovative, customer centric, inclusive, and sustainable materials science company in the world. And I think that's important because an ambition mindset is you're kind of always striving for something. It's not about being the biggest. It's not about being, it's really about being kind of the best in those areas that will then make you a successful company. And so we're really focused on that. And then underneath that, we also developed and rolled out kind of the purpose, so the why behind what we're doing, and that's to deliver a sustainable future for the world through our material science expertise and collaboration with partners. So that piece is embedded into our purpose, is that collaboration with partners. And I think a big part of that is to reflect on and have a little bit of humility around we don't have all the answers. These are big problems that we're trying to solve, right? So climate change and decarbonization, huge challenge. Plastic waste, plastics as a material are critically important. Plastic waste, a big issue, and we need to work across the value chain with all sorts of other stakeholders to help solve that. So I think um, those kind of themes around collaboration really really important. Um, my team's role specifically, yes, is lead generation, to be part of the sales conversion process and all of that. But that's definitely not where it stops. To use the title of the podcast here, right? It's around building brand gravity. We're building brand equity, brand loyalty, leading with our technologies and solutions, and working with all of our partners, customers, and others on how we solve all of those issues. As a B2B company, I think what's really changing when we start thinking about stakeholders is maybe at one time it was feasible for us to really kind of mostly focus on our direct customer. But our direct customer, we're making things that then our direct customer is usually adding to, converting in some way, doing something to it to make the final product, or even just one more step down the chain before it becomes a final product. And so it puts us in a different place. But I think we used to be able to say, okay, we're going to focus on those people, the converters, let's call them. I think now what you're seeing is so many different influence points on consumer behavior, on the value chains, on what is actually driving demand or sending demand signals into the market. It's totally different. So today we have to do a lot more to understand not just our customers but our customers' customers. We have to understand and know if we could have any influence among with consumer behavior or within the whole value chain, and who the value chain captain may be. Where is decision making really happening, or where is change really really happening? So that's a big shift for us. The regulatory environment is driving demand signals in a much stronger way than I think in the past. So if you use, a good example, I think, are if you look at like electric vehicles. Go around the world, and in any one geography, there's a different approach to how we are trying to drive the adoption of electric vehicles. That's a huge thing that we need to understand, and that as business communicators, we need to understand what that environment is, so that as we're out and promoting DAO solutions, we can be aware of the differences in, what Europe is doing is quite different than what the United States is doing, which is very different than what China is doing, right? And so we have to really have that understanding of that policy environment. And then just to name, a couple others, we talked about employees, so I don't want to discount that. That's huge and number one, as we talked about. But then you also look at NGOs and academia and how they have their own platform to drive preferences into the market, and that's just grown exponentially with digital, right? It's just a very different thing that we have to understand. And so for all of my team, really understanding all of those dynamics in anything that we do is hugely important. Where it gets interesting and I think very complex is, on the one hand, through digital channels and through all the technologies that we have and measurement capabilities, we can be very, very targeted, right? We can target messages to a very specific audience. At the same time, everybody has access to a lot of different platforms where they can get messages that are not necessarily targeted at them. So we have to think about all of that as we are driving our various communication strategies. A good example is we recently hosted an investor day, right? So investor day, obvious who the core audience for that is, but it's a public event in terms of we broadcast it, we put stuff out on our website, like anybody can tune in and watch this. And so you then have to think about, yes, your messages are targeted towards investors and owners, a key stakeholder. But as my team was putting together their materials for how we're updating investors on where we are and where we're going within each of our businesses, you have to also think our customers are tuning in, our employees are tuning in, community leaders are probably tuning in, policymakers may be tuning in.
I think that's powerful. It gets back to that word I used earlier, permeability, that, there's, and it's an interesting time, again, a dynamic tension, right? Because with AI and other types of technologies, at least how generative AI or the attempt to get there is being applied now in marketing and communications, et cetera, the targeting will become more predictive, more precise. That's the dream, at least. And many are advancing that. There's a real arms race now in that field. So, technology, tech, marketing tech, all of these things will, the written word, all of this stuff, creative, is expanding and changing. So the targeting will increase, but you're right, there's still increased permeability between audiences. So it does sound like, the teams that you're overseeing, those working on business comms and corporate and issues management and marketing communications and experiential and events, that need to be very mindful of all stakeholders in all contexts and understanding how this context, we're going to weight more heavily to this stakeholder, but others will come along. And how does it resonate first and foremost for those one or two primary audiences, but what are the valences or the vibrations for the others? I mean, that's a pretty dynamic mindset you have to adapt.
Yeah, yeah, and I think like I said, I think it's a big shift. And one thing that I'm blessed to have an amazing team of individuals. So my direct report team are also in their own right senior leaders within our organization, and so we're really blessed to be able to have these conversations and think through, like, how are we thinking about our mindset here, and what do we need to drive down into the teams. And I think one of those is really driving this enterprise mindset. So anything that you're doing, so somebody focused on working within one of our businesses, focused on a specific market in that business in a specific region, is going to have a lot of really great knowledge on how to reach the customer and the primary stakeholders within that region and that space. But everything that they're doing also resonates across a lot of other work that we're doing, and in my view, our overall reputation, right? So I think that this is a mindset of, business communications is yes, hopefully driving sales. That's the intent, but also we're driving reputation. We're driving, and as a company like Dow, people see Dow and they see the red diamond, and they see that brand. They don't necessarily, unlike some of the maybe CPG companies and things like that, as we go by business to different stakeholders, they're not necessarily seeing us based on that business. That's kind of how we're organized, but we're coming forward as Dow. And so I think that our team, this mindset shift about thinking through all the different stakeholders that have some interest in what you're doing, and then how that pulls back into the overall view on how you're managing your reputation as a company, and how you're measuring the impact that you're having on the company. It's easier to measure. Still not super easy, but it's easier to probably measure based off of kind of corporate metrics, right? So your corporate media, social channels, and things like that. It's a little harder to understand what are the big metrics that we want to understand how some of the marketing communications activities aren't just driving sales, but are driving reputation. And so that's a big focus for us right now.
I love the mix of qualitative and quantitative metrics. I think we have to insist on them. It's not just about, oh, here's a number, and also what is the context of that number? What's it meaningful? I mean, one of the things that's really coming through is I feel another binary back in the day was, oh, B2B communications versus B2C. B2B is so rich, so exciting. It is a much fuller ecosystem, like going all the way down to customers, sometimes the consumer market. Dow does so much, for example, in sports sponsorship. That's very, very interesting, and using sport for purpose. And I think that's great. I mean, one thing I want to make sure before we end today, we've been touching on this idea of a matrixed organization, right? So Dow is large, no surprise. It is global. There are many units. And one of the things I've been thinking about as you were talking before, and I think it connects to this, is the importance of we can each get very heads down in our work, heads down on our phone, heads down in our work. And I feel like we need to be eyes up, heads up, look at the big picture of things, right? And it's not just stakeholders outside, it's stakeholders inside. What are some tips that you have for professionals in this space for understanding the skill sets needed to, first of all, understand you're in a matrixed organization? And second of all, actually work in that kind of structure effectively and with like open hearted connecting with other people.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I've mentioned the policy environment a couple of times, and so focusing on that a little bit. I mean, anyone within my team, increasingly is really having to work very, very closely with our government affairs colleagues because while regulatory space is impacting the business, ultimately it's our government affairs colleagues who own those kind of relationships and help us kind of navigate that space. And so it's a great example of leaning into their expertise to help further our communication strategies and understanding the interplay between those two things. But yeah, recently I've been on or leading a number of interview panels for roles that we're filling in different places here and largely in Europe. And I can tell you the number one kind of thing that I'm trying to draw out of people is how they think about working within a matrixed organization. Because I think, one, communicators tend to find themselves in the position within teams of having to bring a team towards consensus or at least a path forward.
Or connecting the dots. Sometimes we know this is happening here, right?
Absolutely correct. And so for my team, you know, a large number of them are sitting within business leadership teams, and so they're connecting with marketing, commercial, sales, technical services, R&D, sustainability. All the different parts that get a business to operate. Communications often plays the role of kind of helping to connect the dots between those folks and drive towards consensus. So that's one big skill set of being able to even work within that context. And then a big company like ours, if you're working on something related to, let's say, plastic waste, I mean, that has business context that's very, or a lot of business interest, definitely corporate interest, definitely geographic interest. And you have to be able to work within all of those things to knock down the silos. We are going to be siloed. We're a big organization. They just naturally exist, right? But you have to be able to understand who are the folks you need to work with and how do you work with them. And so I think that piece is hugely important. Part of that, I think, does also come down to how you build your network. And so how you think about working with people. And so candidly, I think one of the challenges coming out of COVID is we're doing so much virtually that it tends toward, or it can towards the transactional, right? You have a 30-minute meeting on your calendar, you join, you wrap up whatever was on the agenda, and you turn off your camera and you go about whatever you were doing. And so I think it's really, really important, especially for people as they're coming into Dow kind of early on, to be around colleagues and to get to build those networks, because over time, that's how you really learn how you get things done.
I'm glad you're mentioning that because I think it's a skill set. We need to honor what is possible virtually and amazing opportunities, but also honor what is happening in creating deeper relationships, what's required from that, whether you're in physical proximity or not. I love that. I think it's really, really important.
Yep. Um, and so, yeah, I mean, all of that kind of then lends itself to we all operate in the gray space. Things are ambiguous. It, I just believe if you can't operate in that space, it's going to be a bit of a struggle. So I think that that's a skill set that people really need to lean into. I think the hard communication skills. I mean, some people are more naturally better writers or more naturally. I think you can learn really the hard communication skills, and I do believe they're hard. I actually don't love communications being referred to as the soft skills. I think that they are. I think it's very hard to do it well, but how that all comes together. So dealing with a matrix, dealing with ambiguity, having a plan B because things are changing faster than ever before, and so it's okay to have something not work as you thought it might. But how do you adjust? And the last thing I'll say is I think that lends itself to is we're thinking through a lot of what we're doing in the plastic space or energy transition, right? So we're working in the nuclear space. We have a project on nuclear, or our mobility team working on EVs and light vehicles and that kind of thing. These are all really new business models, and so some things aren't going to work out. And I think that we also need to get a little more comfortable in even talking about or how we talk about failure and what we've learned, what we're doing, what we're moving on to. But I think that that concept of it's okay, especially in the environment that we are in today, um, to say we don't know everything. We're going to learn along the way, and some things aren't going to work out. And I think sometimes for a 126-year-old organization like we are versus a startup, you kind of don't you're not as comfortable talking about that. And I think it's increasingly important for us to do so.
Yeah. And it's funny going back to the silos, I was laughing to myself because you're saying obviously Dow is huge, but I've run a company that is like 30 or 35 people and now one that is like 135. And silos exist everywhere. Every human community creates little camps. And that's a beautiful thing. And it's also a challenge, two things true at once. And so before we run away today, Peter, you mentioned the name of the podcast earlier, Building Brand Gravity. Is there anything culture in the world of brands that has you in its gravity? What's something that's exciting to you right now?
Yeah. So actually a few things. So one, I recently read Jonathan Haidt's new book, The Anxious Generation. Um, Amazing book. I think everybody should read this. It is also reading about the anxious generation has made me an anxious parent because I have two little kids, and so it's a book that I just haven't been able to stop thinking about because the research and the data that's presented and it's really hard to ignore about how this like living in this virtual world and on screens all the time, how it's really impacted our kids. And so that one, it's an amazing book. I highly recommend it, but it is not, you come out of it, it's not a light, it'll get you thinking. So that's definitely one. Yeah, absolutely. That's definitely one. The Hard Fork podcast is one. And actually, I think that was recommended to me by GNS's own Kyle Turner.
Oh, he's great.
Yeah, I think
Kyle's on top of everything out there in the tech
absolutely.
world,
And
especially.
he turned me on to this and I listen to it all the time. It's if you're interested in AI, it is or all things really tech, but they spend so much time on AI. They cover the gamut on all the stories, but in a really funny way, and I think it's really really well done. And then the last thing, and it's just something that I've been connecting with my kids on lately. So the Sphere in Las Vegas, I'm sort of obsessed with now. And in part, I thought it was cool before, but they recently had Fish play there for like 5 nights. I'm a big Fish fan, and now Dead and Company or Grateful Dead is doing a bunch of shows there, and the videos that like they're just filling my timelines with the amazing light shows and visuals and everything. So one, I'm super jealous of everybody that's been at any of these shows. But what I think has been kind of cool about it is it's fun to show my kids and it's been a great way to introduce them to some of this music that I love. That I think without this, they would kind of think is um, not so cool.
I love that. Oh, the sphere is such a thing. And yeah, you got to book yourself a ticket. Got to get out there.
I know I'm trying, but No luck yet.
Well, Peter, thank you so much for talking to me today. It's been such a pleasure to have you on Building Brand Gravity, and thank you for making the time.
Thank you. I really, really appreciate it and appreciate the long time partnership with GNS.